Hi, and welcome to Between the Rows. I'll be your host this week, Dave Bedard. So you've probably heard by now that potatoes from Prince Edward Island are being blocked from entering the U.S. potato market. We'll be talking about how the industry got to this point, even though the exact reason for this new ban itself is still kind of a question mark.
Plan's already in place. It's been agreed by both countries. It worked exactly the way it's supposed to. So I'll be honest with you, Dave. We're at a loss.
Also, we've talked before on this show and elsewhere about how Canada's farmers are seeking additional breaks on carbon taxes, and how a lot of lawmakers seem to agree that farmers should have those tax breaks. Today we're going to talk about what form such a tax break should take and why.
So if we just provide a straight-up exemption on fuel purchases, then we're eliminating the signal.
That's all coming up in Between the Rows right after this.
At your Nutrien Ag Solutions retail, we take seed seriously. Getting it right for your farm requires the right knowledge. That's why we operate the largest retail seed trial program in Western Canada. Our local experts can provide you with advice for balancing maturity with disease traits and getting the best seed to your crop. After all, we take your harvest seriously too. Talk to your local retail today or visit nutrienagsolutions.ca.
Well, it looks like we couldn't let 2021 go by without getting wrapped up in yet another new and unusual agricultural trade entanglement with our neighbors to the south, and this time it's not beef cattle, it's not product labeling or prairie wheat or anything like that, it is Prince Edward Island potatoes. Greg Donald is the general manager of the Prince Edward Island Potato Board, and he's here on the line right now to help us make sense of it all. Mr. Donald, hi, and welcome to Between the Rows.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Dave.
To make sure our listeners are all caught up here, I guess we should begin at the beginning. You know, Prince Edward Island, of course, I mean, it looks like a pretty small landmass on an overall map of Canada, but it punches very well above its size in potato production, doesn't it?
It has for many years, yeah. The island, they always call it the million-acre farm. There's actually about 600,000 arable acres that's farmed, and of those acres in any particular year, we produce or farm about 85,000 acres of potatoes. And an average, this year we had a really good crop, Dave, probably the best. I've been in the business over 30 years, probably the best crop I've seen, and both in yield and quality. And but on an average year, we produce about a quarter of the Canadian potato production.
Now, in terms of Canada's potato exports to the United States, how much of P.E.I.'s business is done with the United States?
It would be overall be a significant portion. From P.E.I., it would represent about 40% of our fresh production. So it'd be around 250 million pounds, and that would be worth about $100 million. And this year we were anticipating that would be higher because of the crop we had this year and the shortage of potatoes in the United States this year. Their crop was short there, so we were anticipating selling a lot more there this year. And but that volume of potatoes, to put it in perspective, would provide the annual potato requirements or consumption of about 9 million people. So it's pretty significant.
Wow. So, and of course, as bad luck would have it, just over 20 years ago now, the province started to see cases of potato wart. Now, could you take us just briefly through what potato wart does to potato crops?
Yeah. So potato wart, I think I heard you mention earlier, it is a fungus. It's a soil-borne disease. And it actually, when a potato is infected with this fungus, it can create galls or warts on the potato that make them unmarketable, but it has no impact on human health. And but I'll add, the disease itself really, it causes very little economic loss to the crop. But it's in potato production, it's a very serious quarantinable disease because the spores from the disease, the resting spores, can last for a long time in the soil. So the disease itself causes very little economic damage in a field. It tends to be small, isolated patches where it's been found, in every few years on P.E.I. over the last 20 years, and it really doesn't spread a whole lot. But the major issue with it is it's a quarantinable pest, and because it can survive so long in the soil.
Mm-hmm. Now, I gather it does reduce yield as well to a certain extent, just because these galls can not only form on the tubers themselves, but also on the runners in the plants. Am I correct?
No, we have. Yeah, our experience. It's very. Any of the detections that I've been aware of, at least over the last more than a decade, I would say, they're very isolated. Like the 2 fields this year. They're just small, measured in feet, the actual areas that were infected. So, and it was only a small quantity of potatoes. So, but I believe that's in large part, and that's our experience with here, is because the management plan that we have in place, and it's well known here, and there's lots of testing and folks looking for it, that it's identified and fields are quarantined when that's found before perhaps before that disease establishes and causes more serious damage in an actual field.
Mm-hmm. Now, the United States also had potato wart over a good chunk of the 20th century. They said they succeeded in eradicating it in the 3 states where it was a problem. But, back when it first showed up in P.E.I. back in 2000, the U.S. did stop taking P.E.I. potatoes from coming in. But very shortly afterward, this management plan that you just referred to came into effect, and they started taking them again. The plan seems to be the plan that we've had in place certainly seems to be working for everyone. How has that system operated?
So it's the plan was developed by CFIA, and I believe, like you said, it was a number of years ago. I think it also had some input from the U.S. and industry, and the potato industry here. And but it's ultimately it's CFIA's plan, and they're responsible for its implementation, the oversight of it, and it was actually. Dave, it was enshrined, I'll say, in U.S. legislation in 2015 in a federal order. So it's actually there's a wart management plan, but it's also part of a federal order, and so that's sort of the plan, who's accountable for it, and the governance, let's say, and but that plan lays down rules of what happens when the disease is detected, and it also with movement of potatoes to the U.S. it dictates the provisions that have to be in place for that to happen. So that's why we were really surprised at the detections this year, because they were the 2 detections. They were found in a small number of tubers in 2 fields, and there were 2 processing fields. So there were fields that were planted to supply the local processor, and but as it happens, those 2 fields were already under CFIA surveillance. So the plan worked. We were concerned when we learned about it, and but when we quickly learned the details, the plan has served us well for 20 years. It worked exactly the way it's supposed to. So those fields were immediately quarantined, and then they throw a big net, if you will, very similar to COVID. They proceed with, like when someone has test positive with COVID, they do contact tracing. We all know that. And it could be small or it could be huge if the person had a lot of contacts and so on and so forth, or were in large crowds or whatever. And same thing with this plan. It does the same thing, and it does the fields and seed, where the seed came from. They're called primary contacts, where cultivate, like plow or planter or harvester, that go into that field, and the next one they go to, because it's a soil-borne pest, they're under the surveillance, and then other contact fields. So the field with it is quarantined, and all those other ones also have an investigation and significant soil sampling and et cetera, to make sure that it didn't spread to other fields, or it might have come from another field to that one. And but not only and all the other fields that like maybe a sprayer went through all summer long, they'd all be out. They're part of the testing, and all those fields have restrictions on them. And the other part I'll add to that, they also go backwards 10 years. So every year that field of potatoes in the last 10 years, they do the same thing, the same tracing, and they're all under surveillance. And then they continue to monitor all those fields for, depending on the level of risk, they're all classified for up to 20 years. So I wanted to talk through that, Dave, to demonstrate how extensive this program is, and it's followed, and we're grateful for the folks at CFIA here. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes into that. So it's well managed and back to the fields this year because of that and the circumstances of those two fields. That's why we're very shocked that it's escalated to this point with the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So despite all that, the USDA got in touch with Canadian officials last week and asked that they start banning exports of P.E.I. potatoes to the U.S. just on the basis of these two fields that were discovered in October. So what do we know about the U.S. rationale for this specific request?
So that is, and when we learned of the news last weekend, that's why we were literally shocked, because what I described earlier, the plan's already in place. It's been agreed by both countries. It worked exactly the way it's supposed to. So I'll be honest with you, Dave. We're at a loss at exactly why. What we're hearing as the week goes on here is there's indications from CFA that perhaps the folks in USDA they're just, because we've had detections every, sometimes back-to-back years, or there'd be some gaps. It's just that we continue to have detections that raise concern. That's what we're hearing, but we're not part of those direct discussions like with USDA and CFIA, and that's the indication. And the other concern is that the detections this year, those two fields I said were processing fields, they were with larger farms. Like, generally speaking, the farms in P.E.I., probably compared to Western Canada standards, are pretty small. Even our biggest potato farms, they're relatively small in size. But these two particular farms were very large, or in our standards, they're relatively large. So when I described the other contact fields, so it involves a lot of fields, and because all their fields end up being contact fields. So the investigation, back to the contact tracing and the plan, it's very extensive. So I think that's another factor, is the U.S. wanted to learn more about the investigation. So because it involved so many fields, and but again, from our perspective, we're all about science and doing things right, and our folks here are. I think we are by nature here, and that's why we were a little surprised. Why this disruption in trade while the investigation's going on, and because it's not new, it's something we've been being done for years, and it's so they throw such a big net, and all those fields, I'll reiterate, that are part of that investigation or surveillance, let's say, it doesn't mean any of them have the disease. It just means the plan ensures that they absolutely are okay. So that was the other factor that was cited, that because of the size of the the scale of the investigation, that might have been something that was also of concern. So, from our perspective, like I said, Dave, we have full confidence in the plan, and I'll say we're confident in all our potatoes, but I'll say it this way, particularly looking at fresh potatoes, they are which is big part of that $100+ million to the U.S. I think it's about over $2 million a week we ship here, and it's like 20 loads a day or something, right now that aren't going, tractor trailer loads. But that fresh potatoes are washed. In a lot of cases, they're polished. And they're applied a sprout inhibitor, so they won't sprout, and they're put in a consumer bag. So that's the big question. They're of no risk because of that, and the market, that they're going to, we're kind of at a loss. And adding to that, those same and those, by the way, are part of the management plan as well. Like all potatoes have to be washed and sprout nipped and et cetera that go into the U.S. And there's, I believe, 16 states in the U.S. have regulated pests like potato cyst nematode, golden root knot nematode. Just to give examples, for example, Idaho, is known as Idaho is the potato state of the U.S. It has those two regulated pests. And there's provisions, the same provisions are in place for potatoes from that state coming into Canada. So that's even another reason why we're surprised. Some other, maybe seed potatoes, we're 100% confident in our seed potatoes, but, that are going to be replanted, that might be something that would be a higher risk, let's say, but fresh potatoes do not pose a risk, and the same provisions for potato wort are in place for potatoes coming from very many states in the U.S. into Canada. So we're a little bit at a loss why that was imposed, whether it was a federal order or a voluntary suspension from CFIA, and we're at a loss there.
Now, the suspension was voluntary, like you say. Basically, the USDA seems to have asked Canada to put this export ban in place on threat of possibly a sort of a broader ban that would be imposed from the U.S. side. But I guess the question is now, where does this leave the potato growers of P.E.I? I mean, if you've got these fresh potatoes that are available, do you stand a reasonable chance of being able to sell them to someone if the U.S. border is closed to those potatoes?
There would be very limited. Unfortunately, we only have 160,000 people on P.E.I, and we already we kid sometime here that one potato farm, can supply all of P.E.I and all of our tourists, and but no, because the production this year, basically, I would say the Canadian needs, there's sufficient supply in the marketplace to supply those needs, and where the shortage is in the U.S. There's a significant shortage, and in Western Canada. But I mean, I believe that there's way more potatoes. We're talking, like I said, 250 million pounds. There's way more potatoes than the Canadian market can use. So even there's going to be an imbalance. There'll be too many in Canada and not enough in the U.S.
So even though you're able to ship potatoes domestically within Canada, there's no way that the Canadian market can eat their way out of this sudden surplus that we've got happening.
I do not believe that's possible. That's not possible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So besides the obvious, I mean, if the ban were to be lifted somehow, exports resume, everyone goes on with their life, what would P.E.I potato growers like to see at this point in terms of support while this ban remains in place?
Well, and that's the interesting thing, Dave. It's not just our growers. It's our number one industry on Prince Edward Island. It contributes over, for our small Canadian economy, over $1.3 billion. And and the U.S. part of it is a significant portion of that. So it's not only it is the farms, but all the folks that work on them, and just the ripple effect through our entire economy here. It's just devastating. So it's like this week, some of the packing sheds started laying off workers, and that's an issue, and it's going to continue to be felt, progressively as time passes on here. Like I said, we normally ship over $2 million a week. So to the economy, you could probably multiply that figure by 5 is the impact on the economy here, and directly, all the impact. So in the short term, it'll be, we're still of the headspace that whatever resources our government has to, I guess from our perspective, 2 things: to expedite the investigation, the soil sampling, and we're working on borrowed time here right now. Winter's going to set in, ground's going to freeze, that'll stop. So to as much resources as possible to sample and test and get that over with, and then and all the resources possible to work with the U.S. on if are they confident with the plan, and if they're not, and we're completely open to what do we need to do, like what are the concerns, what are the issues with the plan, and then we'll be game to meet those. So we want to. I think it's important for both countries, those agencies, USDA, CFA, we need to manage pests. In agriculture, we have them all different types right across our country, in the U.S. But it's important that we manage those and we continue to be able to do trade. And that's what we'd like to see. Whatever needs to happen to expedite resolving the issues with the U.S. And if this goes beyond another week or two, we're going to have to make somebody's going to have to make the tough decisions what to do with the massive volume of potatoes. That's a problem in itself, because to destroy them, that would have to be done in wintertime, through snow blowers to fields so they'll freeze. If it's left until, after the intense winter period, I don't know what we'll do with that massive volume of potatoes. Like, you can't dig a hole big enough, or how it'll be a huge biosecurity issue itself. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're at.
From a financial perspective too, though, I mean, is there a possibility of an agri recovery program, the use of any existing federal programs to support growers through this?
Yeah, I think the ag recovery program is to deal with the costs associated with dealing with a natural disaster, I believe. So this is a man-made one. That's what makes it even worse. The provincial government did put forward $10 million this week to help, in the short term with anything, whatever's needed to deal with this situation, and that's good. And but as the days go on, it's going to get much greater. And I'll leave you with this, Dave. Like I said, in this world of there's so much uncertainty and turmoil, and this pandemic and natural disasters. We're seeing the flooding in British Columbia and in Newfoundland too, and the droughts and wildfires and crop losses, and here's a situation that's 100% man-made. It's not necessary, and with food insecurity and escalating prices, we have good product, probably the best crop we've had in years, and this situation is entirely man-made. We have the ability to manage this pest, and we need to have that and resolve the trade issue as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully, as you say, the end zone is in sight. But we'll watch. We'll be watching to see what happens. Thank you very much for your time today, sir.
Thank you for your interest, Dave. Appreciate it very much.
And we appreciate your time. Greg Donald is the general manager with the Prince Edward Island Potato Board. You're listening to Between the Rows. I'm your host this week, Dave Bedard. So a few weeks ago, Canada's ag ministers had their regular chit-chat and issued what they call the Guelph Statement, which led off with sort of their collective vision through the next 5-year ag policy funding framework, taking us out to the year 2028. That statement envisions that Canada is, quote, recognized as a world leader in sustainable agriculture and agri-food production and will be set up to, quote, rise to the climate change challenge, expand new markets and trade while meeting the expectations of consumers, end quote. So that all sounds good, but despite the work Canada's farmers are doing, the fact remains we're still having to burn a lot of fuel and create a lot of emissions up here to produce what we do. And that's getting more expensive now that Canada has put an increasing price on carbon emissions. Now, you know farmers have a strong political case for a carbon tax break on fuel uses such as grain drying, when even the federal Green Party says farmers should have it. But if Canada's whole vision for agriculture is going to be for farming to make bank on being even more sustainable, what form should any further carbon tax break take? Our guest right now has put some serious thought into this. Sarah Dobson is a research associate with the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Sarah, hi, and welcome to Between the Rows.
Thanks so much for having me. Hi.
Hi. Now, you just recently published a new document through the UMC called A Primer on Carbon Tax Relief on Farmers. And you're coming at this from a specialty in energy and environmental policy rather than from the farming end. How did you come to get involved in this specific topic?
Yes, so I work at the School of Public Policy, as you mentioned, in the Energy and Environmental Policy Division. So my day-to-day work focuses primarily on climate policy, but we also have at the school an institute called the Simpson Center, which focuses on issues related to Canadian agri-food and agribusiness. So they had the original idea for this paper following the spring 2021 federal budget, when the Liberal government announced its intent to provide a lump sum rebate to farmers on carbon taxes that they pay. So they then reached out to our group, the Energy and Environmental Policy team, to see if anyone had that knowledge, and it was decided that I would be a good fit. So yeah, I had the opportunity to jump into a new area for me, and I've really enjoyed it. It's been an interesting topic, and I've learned a lot.
Mm-hmm. Now, your paper starts off with an analysis of the effects of carbon pricing on farming so far. And as the price on carbon continues to rise, your data suggests that even if farmers don't have a seriously wet year like they did their infamously a couple of years ago, that their carbon tax bills on grain drying in the future could be much the same as if they did.
Yeah. So, and I guess I'd almost go a little further than that and say that under the status quo, which doesn't provide any support to farmers for carbon tax expenses from grain and oilseed drying, the carbon taxes from these activities are going to keep increasing as the carbon tax increases. So as you mentioned, in 2019, it was a particularly wet year for farmers. One of the things that I read in my research was that a wet spring delayed the planting of crops, and that in turn meant that at the end of the growing season, crops had less time to dry and were harvested at higher moisture content. So effectively, we had a scenario where farmers were hit with a double whammy. They faced both the carbon tax for the first time, and then also this weather-enforced higher fuel usage that was a result of needing to remove this additional moisture. So one of the estimates I saw out of Ontario, for example, was that fuel usage was 2 times higher than it would have been in an average year. But if we look at 2021 now, for example, the carbon tax is now 2 times higher than it was in 2019. So it was $20 in 2019. It's $40 this year, and it's set to keep climbing. So even if 2021 were an average year, I'd expect that carbon tax payments would be similar to what farmers were facing in 2019, and to continue increasing as the carbon tax increases.
Mm-hmm. And as you also point out in the paper, there's a lot of major industries in this country that already get some sort of break on carbon pricing for the fuel that they burn. You know, even though farming in Canada is generally made up of thousands of very, very small businesses rather than a few massive major corporations, big factories, humongous smokestacks. And you say there's a case to be made that farming fits the same criteria for now. This is an acronym I'd never heard before. EITE, is that ETITE?
Usually we just spell it out. So EITE,
Okay.
which stands for emissions intensive and trade exposed. So these are effectively industries that are most likely to experience negative competitiveness impacts as a result of the carbon tax. So either due to the costs that the carbon tax imposes on them and or an inability to pass these costs down to consumers due to international competition. So in order to protect the competitiveness of domestic industries, we see most carbon pricing programs in Canada, so the federal program as well as most provincial programs, providing some sort of support to these EITE industries. If we look at agriculture within the EITE context, there are a couple of things to note. First is that agriculture is near the top of the list of industries for both absolute trade levels and absolute combustion emissions in Canada. Despite that, however, there's very limited analysis that looks at whether the industry meets the criteria to be formally classified as EITE. Second thing I'd like to note, and what I actually found most interesting when writing this paper, is the inconsistent treatment of agricultural emissions. So on the one hand, in most jurisdictions in Canada, there's a large share of agricultural combustion emissions that are fully exempt from the carbon tax. The largest example would be the combustion of gasoline and diesel, or emissions from the combustion of gasoline and diesel in farm vehicles. But then on the other hand, we have emissions such as those attributable to the combustion of natural gas and propane that's used for grain and oilseed drying, and these emissions are facing the full amount of the tax. That's not something we see in other industries, where if an industry is eligible for carbon pricing support, then this support is determined and extended to all combustion emissions in the industry.
hmm As you point out, most farms and their fuel use, I mean, they fall below the threshold for support that most EITE industries would receive. That is, unless the farm is like a major greenhouse vegetable grower or growing a lot of wheat or what have you.
Yeah, so participation in these carbon pricing support programs for EITE industries is typically limited to facilities that have annual emissions above 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. If we look at the most recent data that's been reported to Environment and Climate Change Canada's greenhouse gas reporting database, we see only 40 agricultural facilities in Canada that exceeded this threshold, all of them greenhouse growers, and that's out of about 1,700 facilities in total that have reported. And then one other thing just to note quickly is that EITE assessments are typically applied to industries that are eligible to opt into these carbon pricing programs. So I think that is sort of the main reason that we don't have any formal EITE assessments for agriculture, is that the individual facilities are too small to participate in these programs that are otherwise available.
hmm Now, setting up a tax exemption on fuel use, I mean that seems to me to be pretty straightforward policy. Just like the purple gas I remember going into the farm trucks that we had when I was a kid. But because we're dealing with a carbon tax here, and not just a regular run of the mill excise tax, there's an argument to be made that a straight up exemption on fuel purchases or fuel consumption at the farm level would kind of miss the whole point of a carbon tax in the first place.
Yes, exactly. So the reason we have the carbon tax is we know greenhouse gas emissions are contributing to global warming, and we want to provide a price signal to individuals and businesses to reduce their emissions. So if we just provide a straight up exemption on fuel purchases, then we're eliminating the signal. So ideally, what we want to do when we're looking at providing carbon pricing support, whether it's to large emitters or to farmers, is to find a way to provide support in a manner that preserves the signal or the incentive of the carbon tax.
Yeah. So if we leave the purple gas model aside there, I mean, what other options are there that would encourage farmers to, there's obviously there's other options out there that would encourage farmers to cut down on burning fuel, like you mentioned, a lump sum of, sort of an output based model.
Yeah. So those would be the two alternative options. So the lump sum rebate, as its name suggests, would provide farmers with a set rebate amount per year, while the second option, an output-based rebate, would provide farmers with a set of rebate for every unit of output that they produce. So for example, if that second one, if we're thinking about grain and oilseed drying, this would provide a farmer with a specific amount of rebate for every ton of, say, corn or wheat that they produce.
Mm-hmm. And of course, each of these models would preserve the carbon price signal to the ag sector, but they come with their own challenges too, as you pointed out.
Yeah, so provided the rebates are independent of fuel usage and emissions, then both these models preserve the carbon price signal. If I could just give a quick example, although with the caveat that my knowledge of the technical side of grain drying is somewhat limited, one of the things I read about in my research for the paper is that the installation of a heat recovery system for grain dryers can reduce fuel costs by 20 to 40% without reducing throughput. If we think about providing a straight out exemption to a farmer on fuel costs, then if they're thinking about making an investment in a heat recovery system, for example, there's no benefit to them in terms of a reduction in their carbon tax costs from making this investment because they weren't paying the carbon tax anyways. But if we think about a farmer that's receiving either a lump sum or an output-based rebate, then by investing in a heat recovery system, they're reducing both their fuel bill as well as their carbon tax bill. So that's sort of generally what we mean by sort of preserving the carbon price incentive. In terms of challenges, most of the challenges from lump sum and output-based rebates are really from an administrative perspective. So if we think about extending farm fuel exemptions, we're really just expanding a system that already exists. So it would be very straightforward to implement, and it could easily be made available to all farmers. If we think about lump sum and output-based rebates, on the other hand, there's going to be additional administrative costs. So for example, depending upon how the rebates are determined, they may be unpredictable to farmers, which could hinder their investment decisions. And then if we're looking at output-based rebates specifically, there's also going to be the challenge of figuring out how to define the amount of the output-based rebate, particularly when dealing with a large number of crops that are grown in different conditions across the country.
Mm-hmm. So, just from your own perspective and your own analysis, what's the more workable option of the two? Lump sum or output based?
Yeah, so I shied away from making an outright recommendation in the paper itself.
Fair enough.
But I would lean towards the lump sum rebates. I think it's important to preserve the carbon price signal for farmers, and I think it's possible to preserve the signal while still providing them with adequate support. Something else, if I can quickly note, is that based on my research, the carbon tax over the last 2 years and the costs incurred by farmers over the last couple of years, it's also contributed to the advancement of lower emitting technologies for grain drying. So some of the examples that I came across is research into electrification of grain drying, or companies producing grain dryers that are fueled by biomass, with emissions from biomass not being subject to the carbon tax. So the advancement of these technologies and the incentive to innovate is obviously something that we really want to preserve. If we look at output-based rebates in comparison, that's what we're actually see being used for other EITE industries. But a key difference is that those industries are generally characterized by a small number of large emitters. With farmers, we're looking at thousands of small emitters and also fuel usage that is determined not only by output, but also by weather conditions. So I think it makes the implementation really administratively costly and much more challenging to implement.
So with that in mind, what option do you think governments would be more likely to gravitate toward?
I think it will be really interesting to see where the government goes on this. At the federal level, the House of Commons appears to be divided at the moment. As you mentioned in your introduction, you mentioned the Green Party supporting an exemption. So that is in relation to a bill that was actually introduced by the Conservative Party back in February 2020. And that bill C-206, would extend exemptions on farm fuel to include natural gas and propane. That was passed through the House of Commons with the support of the Conservative Party, the New Democrats, the Green, and the Bloc prior to the end of the most recent parliamentary session. So you have 4 of 5 parties supporting an expansion of exemptions, and then you have the Liberals on the other side who are advocating for lump sum rebates. So with the new parliament having just kicked off earlier this week, I believe it'll be interesting to see where the House goes.
Oh, and we'll be waiting here with our popcorn accordingly. So thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Sarah Dobson is a research associate for the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. You're listening to Between the Rows. I'm your host this week, Dave Bedard. That's it for this week's episode, but we'll be back in a week with more from the Glacier FarmMedia family of publications. One more reminder, if you're not already listening to us there, you can now also find this show on YouTube. Go to the YouTube site, search up Between the Rows Podcast, and look for our logo. And vice versa, if you've just now been happening to find us on YouTube, you can also subscribe to this show through the Apple and Google podcast stores online, or check us out at agcanada.com/podcasts. However you got here, you've been listening to Between the Rows, and I've been your host this week, Dave Bedard. Thanks so much for listening.
At your Nutrien Ag Solutions retail, we take seed seriously. Getting it right for your farm requires the right knowledge. That's why we operate the largest retail seed trial program in Western Canada. Our local experts can provide you with advice for balancing maturity with disease traits and getting the best seed to your crop. After all, we take your harvest seriously too. Talk to your local retail today or visit nutrienagsolutions.ca.